we are focused on, in this symposium, on the phenomenon of life, but often we speak of the phenomenon more in the sense of like just an object of scientific study or, for example, of some kind of a fact of the world, whereas I would like to focus on exactly life as a phenomenon, so to focus on its phenomenal characteristics. Essentially, to look at it as an appearing bodily thing with certain vital qualities. This is essentially what Helmut Plessner, a philosophical anthropologist from the first half of the 20th century, tried to do. And it's a point he keeps emphasizing through his main work, The Levels of Organic Life and the Human, of the organic and the human, as though it's very important to remind us that he is dealing constantly with the phenomenon, with some kind of qualities, with some kind of, as he says, intuition. The reason he goes on this journey is a little different maybe from the discussions we've had so far. He starts this project of trying to understand life, to be able to ground his understanding of the human, to be able to come up with a theory of the human that doesn't end up breaking the human into these two irreconcilable aspects, for example, physical, natural, evolved being on the one hand, and conscious, cultural being on the other hand, which was kind of the situation which science, philosophy constantly found itself, even in the start of the 20th century, and of course even before that. It's an idea, this approach is an idea he also took up from Arnold Gehlen, another cheerful fellow from that period, who also asked, could we not find a kind of key issue that would not introduce the body-soul problem in the first place? And so what is this key issue, according to Plessner and a bunch of other people who we have already mentioned today? It is life. Life is this unifying vantage point from which we could bypass this dichotomous Cartesian dead ends that we've constantly found ourselves in. He begins by trying to avoid making any kind of ontological commitments about some kind of a thing in itself, about the objectivity of the situation, but simply focuses on a kind of phenomenological description. He starts with intuition, and when I speak of intuition, we mean here a kind of Kantian, Husserlian intuition, a simple awareness of things as they are immediately pre-theoretically present to us, the way they are given to us. This intuition, this Anschauung, as the German term goes, doesn't include merely sensual features, but also certain other aspects. He speaks of essences, ideas, which seem to be present as we intuit these various phenomena, in addition to their mere concrete sensual contents. Now, as he observes all the different things that appear in his intuition, he notices that some things seem to have a certain surplus of vitality that seems to make them into a kind of different order of thing compared to the other things. He analyzes in a pretty standard phenomenological fashion the perception of the ordinary phenomenon into this mantle of properties on one hand that seem to gravitate around this kind of core of the thing. But in this analysis, these two aspects, this outer aspect of the thing and the inner aspect, the inner core of the thing, is really just something that is ascribed to by an analytical observer. Meanwhile, when it comes to life, he thinks that these two dual aspects are something that is fundamental to the thing itself. It is a property of the thing itself. It appears a living phenomenon, a living body. It appears in a kind of mode that shows as though it has of itself, in and of itself, a kind of interiority, an interior world, or as Hans Jonas, who I will also be mentioning, says, an inwardness from which this body acts, in which it is also grounded. It seems to have an actual core, a living center, to which then these properties belong. And this fundamental divergent dual aspectivity, this actual the core and the properties that belong to it, is what determines the living phenomenon, according to Plessner, and what discerns it from all the other gestalts that we see in the outer world, and makes them into what he calls wholes. Yeah, I should probably have continued on the PowerPoints. Anyway, so what makes this dual aspectivity possible? That is his next question. And here's where we touch on the question of the boundaries, which we have already spoken about in the first lecture and the discussions. And it's something that, given what I've heard today, I would like to consider in relation to what Plessner is saying. Essentially, things have borders, the point at which they end and the other thing begins. But this is mainly a spatial, perceptual determination that an observer is making. That is what Plessner is trying to say. Meanwhile, the living thing has boundaries. This is something, this boundary belongs to the living thing. It is something the living thing is doing to maintain its identity, to establish a kind of relation with the environment. And it is also this boundary, which is exactly the point at which the dual aspects, the inner transitions into the outer and the outer into the inner. This is the point. Maybe this kind of illustration can sort of demonstrate the main difference. The border does not belong to the actual thing. The boundary belongs to the living body. So, in other words, Plessner defines now life as a boundary realizing body. He constantly, maybe not constantly, but at several points, finds us that when he's talking about boundaries, he's not really talking about cell membranes. And he's not talking about sensual, spatial contours. This is an intuitive phenomenon. It is something that appears with a certain quality that we can't quite express and represent in a sensual form, the way we are used to, for example, in science. And he thinks that the factors upon which the boundaries are based, that in physics and chemistry are defined as forces of cohesion, chemical bonding and so forth, have to be left aside in the logical analysis of this state of affairs. For what Plessner is interested in is merely to present the conditions under which life becomes possible as appearance. So we're not really talking about the actual conditions in reality. We are talking about still on the level of the phenomenon as it appears to us in intuition. Okay. Now, what Plessner spends the bulk of his very labyrinthine levels doing is to try to deduce the so-called essential or vital categories of life, the basic categories which enable life to appear in the first place, from this hypothesis, in a certain sense, of the boundary. Should he be able to deduce the usual characteristics that we deem to be essential to life, he will have, in a certain sense, proved that the boundary is indeed fundamental to the living phenomenon. I will not go into all the details of this journey, but he develops ideas which are very similar to things we've been talking about in relation to inactivism. There's this systemic view of life. There's this processual view of life, the constant emphasis of the relation between the living organism and environment. And these are all things we can get into it in the discussion. But maybe the key point to get to the argument I'm going to trying to be making is that life, because it has a boundary, because it is setting a boundary for itself against a kind of environment, because it is establishing itself with this boundary, life is positional. And this is one of the key characteristics of living phenomena as well. That they are positional, which means that they are positing themselves into themselves. So this is, again, something that seems to be happening on the phenomenal level. It's nothing we need to think of in very concrete terms. This positing in itself is basically, I think, the equivalent of autonomy. And also it's related to boundaries. And it is also positing itself out and beyond itself as it comes into a relationship with its environment, as it tries to meet its needs and to respond to its challenges. Different kinds of beings achieve this positionality in different forms. They take different organizations. They negotiate this independence of theirs and their dependence on the environment in different forms of life. And here Plessner sees two key forms: the open form of the plant, which is integrated with its environment, is very much dependent on it and all its vital functions. It has no real operative self, and it has also no real operative consciousness. Not so with the animal, who has developed a central nervous system and is thereby able to represent its body to itself. The animal has this, we're probably familiar with this term, has a living body, a life. It is acting out of this a kind of center within itself. It is, as Plessner puts it in his wonderful manner, just a second, oh yeah, this is still it. It is the living thing in itself. The living thing is itself in itself. And it is mediating its environment constantly via its body. The animal has this centric existence. It is making use of its body. It's controlling its body, and it's sensing. But it is kind of tied to this centricity. It is tied to a kind of living execution from a certain here and now. And at the same time, this centric existence from which it lives and from which it takes hold of its body, with which it tries to move around in the world, is kind of the basis for a sense of selfhood. It is a me in possession of a body, trying to act in the world. So there's this extra level of mediation here. We had some mediateness in the organism or life at its basis, because it has a boundary. It is constantly mediating with the environment and with itself to maintain its existence. But with the animal, we have this extra layer of mediation via its living body. And this is also a point that Jonas emphasizes as well, although he comes to it by quite different paths. He says that the animal is mediating in its life via perception, mobility, but also, he adds here, emotions. Now, what could be the next step? The human is the next step, of course. He is still a centric animal. The human is not some kind of a transcendence of the animal form. He is still anchored in this living executive center of the animal in the here and now. But it can also posit itself into his very centricity in this living center of his. But this means that if he is positing himself into this centricity, he has already taken a relation towards it. He has taken a step back from the center, which means he's not merely living out of his center, but as a center. He not only has this life, this living body, but knows of having this body. He is a self, but he also has himself. He has noticed himself and has thereby stepped behind himself. And there are a lot of similar formulation. He is also experiencing his own experiencing. So there's all along there's this idea of reflexivity which has come into the equation here. Of course, the human is aware of all this. He is at the same time a living body, that he is within a living body, within his life, but he's also outside this body, outside this body as the kind of point of view of the I, of the subject, which seems to be in possession of all of this. And he is split between all these aspects as an interiority within a body, and at the same time as a body among other physical bodies. This is an idea, again, which is strikingly similar to what Hans Jonas is saying, that the human has distanced himself from himself and has thereby made himself the subject into his object. Or as he puts it, only over the immeasurable distance of being his own object can man have himself. But this also means that with this extra layer of mediation, the human no longer only has an environment geared towards its body, it has an outer world which seems to be filled not just with things that are there for it, but objects that seem to have a weight of their own, that point as though they themselves have a kind of core of their own. Now the question I would like to open, and I think it's something that we've touched on in the discussions already, is that the human in this situation is faced with a problem of being aware that whatever he is experiencing may be no more than a mere content of his consciousness. It could merely be an image that he has made. And what is it that could possibly save him from this predicament of idealism? Plessner started the levels, like chapter 2, he makes this explanation, the way he sees the Cartesian dualisms, or their various consequences, which for him lead inevitably into some kind of dualism or very limited empiricism. But he thinks that the way he can show the human the way out of this immanence, this being captured within his consciousness, is just by the very fact that the human knows that he is experiencing. He knows he may be experiencing nothing more than the mere contents of his consciousness. It is this very knowledge, this ability to take a certain step back from the contents of his consciousness, that creates this opportunity for them being something more than that. He knows that it may simply be, this reality may simply be a kind of interpolated image of reality, as Hans Jonas puts it. But knowing that we've left our mark all over the things that we are experiencing, he also has this ability, by acknowledging its presence, to also judge its extent, and in a certain sense, then to limit it. Knowing he can make images of reality, this is the way Jonas puts it. Knowing he can make images of reality also means he can become conscious of its imaginary nature. He can become conscious that he may be seeing just a screen of representations, but just this knowledge is what allows him to consider the idea of peering behind this screen of representations. And it also means that he has established a kind of standard of fidelity. As he's making images, he's trying to make them more or less like the things that appear to him. And this means he has a certain differentiation between that which is represented, that which is doing the representing, and also the physical carrier of this representation. In other words, the human is aware of the mediacy of his reality. And this is just what allows him to start trying to transcend this mediacy, or to try to go behind it. Jonas has this idea that the negative recognition of the possible falsehood of the images he is seeing may be just what allows the human to start to positively pursue truth. And he sees in this the beginnings of theory. So, to put these two together, it seems that it is human reflexivity, the human's discovery of his own immanence, the imaginary nature, the possible imaginary nature of his reality, which is what allows him to start transcending this immanence, even if he may never truly achieve that. Or in other words, this kind of Cartesian doubt of the groundedness of phenomena is the opportunity for their independent reality. It seems that this anthropocentric, anthropomorphic position of the human, the fact that he has made himself, as Jonas puts it, and as Protagoras put it, the measure of the world, is just what allows the world on its own to start coming into being. This is furthermore not important just for an attempt to try to ground a kind of idea of objectivity. It is also important for the study of life, which is what we're trying to deal with here. Jonas and Plessner both think that initially we have no real conceptual distinction between what is alive and what is dead. What we have is a kind of direct, private evidence, inward evidence of our own aliveness. And we mediate our realities through this subjectivity. We make ourselves, as I said, the measure of the world. We make our psychophysical totalities that we have access to the maximum of the world, under which we then subsume the world. So the result is a kind of personification, a subjectification, and a vitalization of the world. Jonas speaks here of a kind of primitive pan-vitalism, which he thinks was the initial state, when everything in the animist's imagination, even in the imagination of a child, seems to be alive. It is only because we know this life, but because we also, by way of this reflexivity, which I spoke about before, have a relation to it, have taken a step back towards it, that we can start to also know of life, and to start to consider what might in fact not be alive. We can start to subtract or limit this anthropomorphic, the pan-vitalistic tendency from the world. Jonas here says that this is the advantage we poor mortals have over Jean's mathematical God. Happening to be living material things ourselves, we have in our self-experience, as it were, peepholes into the inwardness of substance, thereby having an idea, or the possibility of having an idea, not only of how reality is spread and interacts in extensity, but of how it is to be real and to act and to be acted upon. And this is the ground of Jonas's famous idea that life can be only known by life. It can be only known by life because life is, it takes being alive, it takes being having this perspective and experience of being alive to be able to even appreciate the idea of vitality and to start seeking it or subtracting it from the outer world. The problem I had with Jonas's approach is that he doesn't really lay out a very clear methodological basis for what he's doing. He's just jumping around different levels. He at one point calls for us to imagine ourselves to be kinds of explorers from some alien planet or something like that, and to then try to understand what is specific about the human, for example. I think Plessner has a better, clearer pathway because he starts simply with the phenomenon and then tries to deduce from this living phenomenon its own justification. He starts with the basic living phenomenon and then tries to deduce the human eccentric form from it, and it is just the human eccentric form which allows him to start grounding the phenomenon itself in a certain sense, the thing in itself, rather than being captured in this immanence. What both Plessner and Jonas try to do with this project is to ground their philosophical anthropology, in its essence, on a philosophy of life. And this is how they achieve it. But I think the lesson here is broader. It's not just that we have to base a philosophical anthropology on a philosophy of life. We have to base a philosophy of life on a philosophical anthropology. And I think this is where I want to allude to this constant idea that we've also brought up before of a kind of circularity. To be able to study phenomena like life, to be able to appreciate a kind of objectivity, we need to be very much aware of the human situation, of the way the human perceives himself. We need to know that we have this anthropomorphic, anthropocentric position, so we can start divorcing itself from it. But this means that we kind of have to turn this realization of the anthropocentric, anthropomorphic position, to make critical use of it, and in essence to build an anthropology. Which means that we have to base the philosophy of life on philosophical anthropology as much as we have to base the philosophical anthropology on the philosophy of life. I think there's an interplay here that was also displayed. I think we've mentioned Plato before. In Plato we have this constant switching between different levels of analysis. At one point he's talking about individual, the justice in the individual, then he's talking about a political level, and suddenly he is on the metaphysical level. It seems like he might have recognized that it is impossible to just study one level without constantly referring and being in a kind of dialectical play with all the other levels. In other words, I think there's this is an argument to maybe against the idea, which is to a certain degree still present, that we can simply construct the human, or really anything that a human is interested in, without an understanding of the human already present. We can't really start bottom up no more than we can start from the top to bottom. We have to embrace this circularity once again. And I think, to allude to one of the sections of metanoia, we have to embrace this kind of Ouroborean dialectical play between these different levels of analysis to really be able to appreciate a phenomenon without limiting ourselves too much. So, to summarize, for science, to be able to do this scientific project in the first place, for the objectivity that it requires, or that we require of it, and even to study life, we need to understand humans. We need to understand our own anthropocentric position, which is the source of this perspective of life, knowing life, so that we can study it. And also we need to make this anthropomorphic position into a kind of anthropology. Which kind of brings me to question what Jonas really meant when he said that we should imagine ourselves to be alien explorers when we're trying to determine what the essence of the human is, because it seems what he's saying actually requires us to be the kind of thing the human is, or that the living thing is, to be able to really study it. We can't just be something else and then pretend to have the necessary access it takes to be able to study this phenomenon. So it takes knowing what it is to be alive, to know of life, and to know life. And I would say there can be no philosophy of life that is not lived. But the life we know is the life of the human. And that's why I would end on a Socratic note. That's why to know life, we must know ourselves. And that's my part.
Yes, the first question goes towards.
No, you can go first.
No,
God help me.
Stop with the clapping.
It's just something that is very close to my interest. Like I just wanted to understand the life can only be known to life perspective more. Is this kind of like first person perspective, as you would talk about, like subjective experience kind of thing? And if it is similar to that, do you also have a kind of zombie problem with life, that like you can only tell from your own experience that you're alive, so you cannot know if other things that behave as they're alive, if they're really alive, like the zombie problem for consciousness?
Well, my personal interpretation is that it has to do all with the subjective experience of being alive, because you have a certain experience of what it is to be a living being. Jonas also talks about teleology, which I didn't bring into the equation because it brings a whole other host of issues. You're able to appreciate the idea of something being alive and to search for it or subtract it from other things. Whereas for the zombie problem, I don't really have an answer to that. I don't think either Jonas or Plessner really dealt with this idea. It wasn't even concocted up at that point. I think it was a bit later. But I think that is a serious a kind of problem which Plessner alludes to when he says that some characteristics can indicate life without there really being life present. But he thinks that if he's able to deduce more constitutive characteristics of life, and also this indicative characteristics, in addition to that, he will have kind of covered this ground. But this is a problem that I've been thinking about. I'm not really sure what to answer to it.
So would you say that we are alive according to Plessner's account, from your perspective?
Now I'm starting to doubt.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so you like said that Plessner has a more clear methodology because he stays on the level of phenomena, but like aren't we all, and then you go on that like this sort of distancing from the phenomena realm can give us perhaps a way onto like exploring the thing in itself, but only through this phenomena level first. But aren't we like also when we talk about, I don't know, mathematical descriptions of, or like even enactivist descriptions of cognition, minimal cognition, so like self-organization and whatnot, like a neurophenomenology is about like trying to see how these two kind of like interact or supervene, or like, you know, going, like taking seriously what the phenomena looks like and like describing it, but also descriptions on the level of like self-organization and whatnot are descriptions that go, you know, that are not only subjective or like. So what do you think about this sort of that you have to, or that we are trying to intermesh?
I think it's something that Varela, in his early articles, emphasized constantly, this perspective of the observer, even in the tree of knowledge. Always mix it up. In the tree of knowledge, they're constantly trying to remind us of this perspective of the observer. But I think it's something that kind of got put to the wayside in some strands of inactivism. It's not something that it's something that everyone seems to think. Yeah, you have to bear this in mind, but it's not really clear what this means in practice. How do you actually take this into account? So yeah, maybe neurophenomenology tries to piece it together, but even then. I'm not really sure about neurophenomenology. I don't know it well, so I can really answer that. What exactly they're trying to do there specifically. But in activisms that I try to deal with, I think it's never really clear what our perspective is. Like, are we trying to look at these concrete things in themselves, these cells, and to determine their membranes, and then to construct a cognitive system out of that, or are we observing phenomena? Because I think Varela, in some pieces, really does emphasize this point that yeah, this is a phenomenon, and it is in the mathematical attempts to kind of get down this. Idea of boundedness. He's constantly trying to go to other levels, I think, of analysis, but I'm not sure it's so clear among an activist in general what level they're really, what's their starting point.
Also, just a quick like side question, like when you like this going from okay, we have to start from the phenomena, but then human beings like realize that they can have this distance, that they are, you know, already in the life world. But does the fact that humans start from it necessarily imply that it's ontologically primary? Like, do you know what I mean? So even like it's epistemologically primary, okay? Nobody may be questioning that we all start from like a life world of, you know, we're always already embedded in a life world. But does that necessarily mean that that's also the level of ontological primacy? Because just by, you know, detaching yourself from this, explanation starts, right? And explanations then go beyond what is merely manifest or what is merely on the phenomenal realm.
I think Plessner wouldn't say he wouldn't make any ontological claims at this point. He simply starts with what is given to him in intuition, and he doesn't make any claims whether this is like some kind of a thing in itself or whether it's just a figment of his imagination. He only touches on these topics at the very end of this analysis. So I don't think the reason he starts with it is because he thinks it's primary in any sense. And I don't think it also, his final conclusions would support the idea that it's ontologically primary. Although I'm not really sure what this would mean, that it's ontologically primary. I mean, what do you mean if that it's ontologically primary?
Like I have this image of from Gregor's presentation where he had like the phenomena here and then you had like the mechanism here, right? So mechanistic explanations would say, okay, what's real is these parts that are like interacting here at the mechanism. Okay, but we can like kind of see it also as a phenomenon because of our, I don't know, cognitive apparatus. But you know, we see Gestalt only because of how we are as cognizers, but what is real is like the mechanism beneath it. And then you could also argue that no, actually this Gestalt has a, like, I think I read like yesterday in one of the Verla and Weber's article that Jonas says that it's an ontological surprise. So this identity is not merely a phenomena, but it has like an ontological reality.
May I ask?
Question still?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe I would try to answer this question in a way that would tie it to what Konrad was saying when we were having the first discussion. Namely, the question was, for example, with regards to the mechanism or mechanistic accounts. As Konrad said nicely, and this is something that Plessner would subscribe to, if you have a mechanistic account, well, you know, that's marvelous, that's great. You have a mechanistic account, you can provide a certain something, but how do you delineate a certain domain within which you move? And I think that basically what Plessner is trying to do is, in his understanding of the history of philosophy and how you had this back and forth after the Cartesian move and the split, so from two extremes, realizing both the limitations of both, and then through such traditions as Dilthey's Lebensphilosophie, he tries to reintroduce the domain of the lived experience, of the Lebenswelt, and all of that, which is precisely the domain which he tries to revitalize and articulate and make philosophically robust, where you could speak about these types of questions. How do you get to the delineations that are significant for then doing a certain type of, say, mechanical analysis? Because usually when you do a certain mechanical analysis, you presuppose a certain something. And let me give you an example that is not prototypically mechanistic, but in the tree of knowledge. For example, when Maturana and Varela say, when we talk about life, the laundry list approach is problematic, if you just list certain things. Because they say, you have a certain implicit understanding of what life is, and if you want to be kind of fair to the phenomenon itself, you better find a way to articulate it in a way that is in line with this. They don't go into then reflection on what it means to have an implicit understanding. This is where Jonas enters the picture. If this was a Wikipedia page, you would click on that, and then you would get a long list of what Jonas is trying to do when he's trying to articulate, you know, what are what as he calls them, these criteria of intuition, of Anschauung, in which aliveness gives itself to you as a specifically bounded something. Yeah?
I mean Plessner, probably.
Plessner, what did I say?
Jonas.
Sorry, Plessner, that's what I meant. So this is
Jonas doesn't cover this, and that's
yeah. No, it's
Plessner.
It's Plessner. Of course, I made a mistake. So this is basically and of course you can then problematize. But for him, it would be a problem if you then did this type of analysis and say this is now accounting for the phenomenon itself. Well, he would say that's a bit of a stretch. That's a bit of a problem. Yeah, what you're doing is a different type of stance or different type of investigation, and it's legit, but we're not necessarily talking on the same level, or we're talking cross purposes, you might say. These are interrelated, but we're doing different projects. Now, how they fit together and what have you, that's a different. But this would be a Plessnerian answer in the context of what we were talking about.
And if just a direct quote, which I think would also answer this, which I read earlier on, the factors about which the boundaries, he was talking about the boundaries, but I think we could apply this to this as well, are based, and that in physics and chemistry are defined as forces of cohesion and so forth, have to be left aside in the logical analysis of this state of affairs. He's simply not really interested in addressing this specific aspect at this point.
This is actually the source of friction, I would say. You have this strict division between the science of boundaries, including organismic boundaries, and the intuition of organismic boundaries. Because someone might claim that these are two different projects, practically speaking, institutionally speaking. One is maybe in the Department of Philosophy and the other one in someplace else. But should we, I'm the boundary guy here, so should we draw this clear-cut boundary between philosophy and science? And I mean, we should discuss this thing during the general Q&A, because this is the most controversial thing. I mean, your presentation resonates with so many things in my own thinking, but this is one thing that I would be really cautious and skeptical about. And it has to do with many different practical issues, like, for example, why these non-dualistic approaches, why we have so many people arguing for some sort of non-dualism or seeking some sort of non-dualism when it comes to the living creature versus the environment relationship. Some sort of non-dualism, like Husserl, like Galen, like Plessner, like Leonas, and all these people, Merleau-Ponty, and you can provide a whole list. And still, the mainstream is very much dualistic. How come? And I would risk a claim that one of the reasons is this clear-cut distinction between I'm doing philosophy and you're doing science. I'm doing science and you're doing philosophy. It goes back to Kant. Kant is responsible for that because he is the first one to draw this distinction between science and philosophy. Before Kant, prior to Kant, it was not that clear. For Leibniz, it was not clear. For Descartes, of course, and many other people. So this is a real source of friction here, and yeah. So we should perhaps discuss this thing during the general Q&A.
Let's really mark this one because it's interesting. We have two more questions now. You agree? Which of the two questions is the shorter one?
I'm not directly response to this conversation.
Oh yeah, okay. So that was I really agree with you, Konrad, that we shouldn't really, I think, make too sharp of a distinction between what philosophy here is doing, or let's say what phenomenology is doing and what science is doing. And my reason for, let's say, yeah, okay, so you start from a phenomenon, from something what is directly given to you in your experience. But then, like, let's consider like what Plessner says about like the historical development of intuitions. So you have, if you suppose that you really have some sort of animistic prehistory of human thought, then there's obviously a very different intuition at play of what you think life is, where you recognize how you would recognize life. So if we were to start from that prehistoric intuition, then you would probably have a very different kind of starting point for doing science. Like if you were to, if those people were to have some sort of mechanistic science of living beings. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that really the point I think that to consider here is that you have to have some sort of circularity, or let's say like what you're doing. What I think that any scientist or phenomenologist are really doing, they're trying to sharpen or make an intuition more robust, and this could be done by way of like third person, let's say, science, or by first person, like phonological analysis. But like you see that both are in this sense dynamic. So, well, I guess the question would be then, yeah, what is the end point of this? Like, what are you really doing when you're sharpening this intuition? Like, are you approaching something real, or what are you really doing? So yeah, I'm going to end on this problematic note.
I have no points for discussion.
Okay, I think that we can wrap it up here because we have to continue. So another round of applause.